Final conference predictions. This is it. This is the one I want you to hold me to. Anything else I've said beforehand, completely disregard. It never happened. The ACC is going to pan out as follows. We start the season with FSU having an over-under win total of 9.5. Miami's got that as well. Clemson's got an over-under win total of 8.5. However, Clemson has slightly better odds at FanDuel at the moment to win the conference than do the Miami Hurricanes. Okay, well, that's what FanDuel's odds market says. What do I say? I say that I have shifted here. We made predictions a month ago. Those no longer exist. I have shifted. We've gathered as much intel. We've gone and seen as many teams in person as we can, which is tricky. You've looked at injuries. We've looked at everything we can possibly look at. I am keeping my same ACC championship prediction in terms of matchup, but I'm going to go with Miami over Florida State to win the conference. My thinking here is several-fold. So the first is, I don't think many people doubt the players. I don't think many people doubt the talent roster at Miami. If I were to go as far as to put those players in Clemson uniforms, I think Clemson would be a consensus favorite to win this conference. And the reason's obvious. The reason is because you've come to trust Dabo Swinney. You've come to trust the profile of the program. They have delivered in big moments before. Dabo has been at the mountaintop a couple of times. You guys don't trust Mario Cristobal. A lot of you don't. You guys don't trust that coaching staff. A lot of that coaching staff's an unknown. I get why you're there. I just don't I don't think living in the rearview mirror in this particular case is the best way to go about forecasting this season, because they got it on the line of scrimmage. And they're surprisingly, I think, deep, deceptively deep at tailback. They're going to probably end up having the best quarterback in the conference, in my opinion, in Cam Ward. Pass rush will be filthy. And I think they match up, therefore, very well with everyone they play, because I think they can win in a variety of ways. It should be a team that continues to get better. This should not be a team whose peak comes in the first few weeks and then fades off. Very intentional about that. They've been very intentional about everything they've done down there in that vein. And so I'm going to take Miami over FSU. Clemson, I'm right there with them. I just still, in terms of consistency offensively and the overall high-level depth, that's what I doubt about them. Too much to put them in the conference championship game. Don't expect a bad year for Clemson, but I did not find myself able to take the added step with the Tigers there. Virginia Tech and NC State did get looks, partly because I think the quality of team will be enhanced, partly because they both have very workable schedules. Neither of those would shock me, being in the conference title game. I think I would be pretty surprised if either won the conference title game, though. And I know you can say, well, that's only one more game, but without divisions, they are guaranteed to play the best the ACC has to offer. I think that'll be Miami. I think they'll win it. Let's move on. We go in no order whatsoever here. The SEC is next up. I think I had Texas versus Ole Miss about a month ago. Many people disagreed, not shockingly. So right now, the up-to-the-minute FanDuel odds board looks as follows. Georgia is number 1 and Texas is number 2. Those are the only teams in the conference with win totals in the double digits. Both of them are at 10.5. Bama, Ole Miss, LSU, those are the 3 with win totals at 9.5. Now, Tennessee, actually Missouri has 9.5 as well. Tennessee has gone from like 8.5 to 9.5 back down to 8.5. So there's been a lot of fluidity with the Vols. Here's where I'm going to land in the SEC. I am keeping Texas as my conference champ. I am replacing Ole Miss with Alabama in the conference championship game. So fitting that Colin had B-roll of Sark in Bryant-Denny Stadium to start this. I'm going to take Texas over Alabama in the SEC championship game. The collective level of talent at Texas, I trust. I trust that while it may not be a shot-for-shot remake of last year's team, you lose guys on the interior of the defensive line. What I look at is the aggregate of talent acquisition. And at Texas, they've done it plenty well enough, and they've spread the talent all over the roster plenty well enough that in the aggregate, this team should be good enough. They should be good enough to be favored most every game they play. I also think there's this thing that'll happen psychologically with Texas going from the Big 12 to the SEC. There's a thought that, well, if they had close games in the Big 12, they may get chewed up in the SEC. I actually think it gets your attention when you look out over the horizon and you see a different caliber opponent on your schedule. I think it'll serve them well. I think the same thing will happen at Oklahoma, by the way. I just don't necessarily think it's Oklahoma's year to compete for the SEC championship. But I'm taking Texas there. Pass catchers, they backfilled them really well. I had some concern about that. I don't have concern. My concern is about their depth at tailback, but I think in a complementary fashion, they will find a way. They'll find a way to get it done. Quinn Ewers has a big year, and I trust Sark calling plays as much as I trust anyone on either side of the ball. Bama, I think, will gain steam as the season goes on. I think they'll be one of the best rushing teams in the SEC as well. I am cautiously optimistic about their defense. They don't have game records. Them and Georgia both strike me as programs that have accumulated really solid veteran depth on the defensive front. They don't match the vintage versions of themselves. This is not mid-20 teens Alabama in terms of a pass rush, I don't think. On the interior, I mean. This is not Georgia a couple of years ago in that vein. They're both plenty good enough to be there. I think Alabama's going to continue to scale, and Kalen DeBoer, man, he inherited just a much better roster situation than I think most people realize. Bama's not down the notches that I think people think they are. And they will develop wide receiver 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So I think Bama's going to be right there. Georgia is right there as well. I've got them power rated as slightly better than Texas and Alabama. It's just that I don't have them significantly better, and Georgia's schedule is tougher. This is a very nip and tuck thing. Georgia could just as easily be in there over either one of these teams. If they all played the same schedule, I'd have Georgia in there and have them winning it. But I may differ with the pack in that I don't think that there is any kind of gap between, or there's not much of a gap between Georgia and the next couple of teams in the SEC. I think it's very competitive. Georgia plays both of these teams on the road. They play Ole Miss on the road. They play Tennessee. I think the totality of Georgia's schedule is a little bit too much. Still solidly a playoff team, but I think that's what keeps them out of there. LSU is a team with an over-under win total of 9.5. I have far too much doubt about the consistency of LSU's offense. I think turnovers at the quarterback position have been a bit too much of an issue in fall camp for me to totally feel comfortable with. I'm going to have to see that defense have quantum leaps in improvement, but I will say this. If they get past USC and they have an emphatic statement in week 1, that can be a team that's off to the races. So take the doubt I just had. Well, if it's not valid, and we'll know early on if it's not, that could be a team that's off to the races. Remember that game against Ole Miss? They got a massive bye advantage there. They will be rested at home. Ole Miss playing their 7th game in 7 weeks. So the schedule could all of a sudden, after 1 week, make you look and say, I may want to rethink that LSU pick. Can't do that, though. Got to make the pick right now. Ole Miss. I think the secondary games on their schedule are a little more treacherous than folks are making it out to seem. Ole Miss's schedule is on the screen right now, and everyone's eyes go to at LSU, where they are significantly disadvantaged, like we just said, in terms of bye week. But then it goes to the Georgia game, and it's like no one's paying attention to the fact that they play Kentucky at home. Kentucky's a top 30 team in the JP poll, and should be. They should be power rated up there. They go to South Carolina. At South Carolina, still pretty early in the season when South Carolina still has their legs. Maybe Lenora Sellers is popping over there. They've got Oklahoma at home. People just chalk that up as a win. I'm not sure what world folks are living in, where you just kind of think you put the penciled-in W's next to Oklahoma at Florida. Now, that's later in the year, and maybe Florida's done in by that point. If that game were higher, if that game were earlier in the year, I'd have a lot more concern about it. But the totality of that schedule is not as easy, I think, as people make it. I think Ole Miss is a playoff team, though. I just don't have them in Atlanta anymore. In the Big 12, this is by 10 miles the most unpredictable conference in college football this year. I have called it America's College Football Conference. I believe that. I believe that pound for pound, this is the most fun you could have watching this sport this year. If you say that you miss the way it used to be, not in 1967, but maybe even in 2007, then this is the conference for you. The most unpredictable that you could ever imagine. Utah has not played a single conference game in the Big 12. They're the favorite to win the conference. They're brand new, and they're favored to win the conference. Right behind them is Kansas State, Oklahoma State. UCF has surged. UCF now has the 4th best odds to win this thing. Better than Kansas and Arizona. Iowa State's had some money come in on them. Not just mine, but mine is in on them. So here's where I'm going in the Big 12. I am keeping the matchup that I had. I've got Iowa State versus Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. I am taking Oklahoma State to win that because I think if Oklahoma State's there, then they have perfected the style of play I think they're equipped to put into practice this year. And if they've perfected that, then they're as good a matchup as any for Iowa State, and I think they beat Iowa State if they're there. This is really, really tough because there are like 4 or 5 other teams. I'm terrified to overlook Avery Johnson at Kansas State. I am very curious about Utah. They play Oklahoma State on the road in week 4. 2 schools have thought about Utah. I've got one. We'll see if it's right. Utah was always a matchup nightmare in the Pac-12 because Utah was the only school that played their style of ball in the Pac-12. In the Big 12, a bunch of other folks play that style. This is not the pinball conference it once was. This is a roll up your sleeves. This is a get your lip bloodied sort of conference now. Has been for a few years. They play good defense. That doesn't mean they're going to litter the first round of the NFL draft, but if you understand how fundamentally sound football looks, they play it in the Big 12. So Utah goes from a conference where virtually no one plays the way they do, and they're a matchup problem every week, to a conference full of folks who try and do what they do. It may be that Utah still does that better than anyone else, but I actually think what used to be an advantage for Utah is not nearly as much of an advantage anymore. And in totality, maybe the schedule catches up to it. Maybe Utah doesn't stand out. And I'm taking a chance on that because they could very easily stand out and just steamroll their way to Dallas for the Big 12 championship game. But I don't think so. I think it'll be Iowa State versus Oklahoma State. And I think the biggest wild card here for me is UCF. I understand why they've surged the way they have. Wild cards in the Big 12, it's kind of relative because Kansas is also that. West Virginia and Arizona are also that. I took about 10 minutes and looked at Texas Tech and TCU today. I could very easily make an argument for TCU, who, by the way, I didn't plan on doing this. Let me just tell you, I've got 10. I did have this written down. I've got 10 Big 12 teams in the top 40 of the JP poll, and all of them except for one, it's all like 20 to 40. Like, that's where the conference is. There's not a national championship contender here. It's a conference that probably gets one team in the playoff. I think that'll be the case. Unbelievably entertaining product ahead. Iowa State, Oklahoma State's my pick. That's by far the lowest confidence pick I have in terms of a matchup. In the Big Ten, I think this is the highest confidence I have in a matchup. I'm taking Ohio State and Oregon, same as I did a month ago. I'm taking Ohio State to beat Oregon, same as I did a month ago. They match up in week 5 or 6, whichever it is, October 12th in Eugene. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter who wins that game. It matters. But I don't think the outcome matters in terms of what this matchup will be. From the psychological standpoint, being able to preach get back and revenge to your team for the better part of a season, yeah, that's great. And the loser will have that advantage, if you want to call it that. They'll also have far less margin for error. But I think they'll meet in Indy. I think there is a little bit of a gap between these two teams and the rest of this conference. Ohio State has to get this done. Ohio State has to get this done. They have to beat Michigan. I don't care. If they lose to Oregon, that's not the end of the world because they get a shot at Penn State a few weeks later, and they get Michigan at home at the end of the year. And if they win those two, it doesn't matter. They will be in Indianapolis. I don't think that defense is going to let them down, even if they do lose to Oregon early. I don't think Oregon's going to Indy and us watching Ohio State's defense let them down. I think Ohio State's going to come through. I think they got to come through here. Now, they'll be in the playoff unless they suffer a third loss. They'll be in the playoff, but if they're not able to get it done against two of these premier teams on this conference schedule, they're not going to win the national title, in my estimation. It probably means quarterback hamstrung them too much. That's probably what it means. I don't think that's the style this team will take on. I think there's as much a sense and urgency for a team this talented as we've ever seen, and I think they'll show it. Michigan and Penn State, I simply think, are a little bit of a notch below those other two. Both are playoff caliber teams. I don't think they're going to win this conference this year. So the number one and number 2 odds teams in Ohio State, Oregon, according to FanDuel, are the teams I have playing for the Big Ten Championship. So we're taking Ohio State over Oregon. I'm taking Oklahoma State over Iowa State. I'm taking Texas over Alabama, and I'm taking Miami over FSU. And of course, in terms of the new playoff, which I'll talk about later in the show, or if you're watching the individual video, I talk about it in another video, that would mean that your buys, your number 1 through 4 in any order for the playoff would be Ohio State, Texas, Miami, and Oklahoma State. And then we got a G5 team in there somewhere. We let the chips fall where they may for the other, what would that be, 6 spots, I guess, 5 or 6 spots.